Hello, I'm Tye, and welcome to the Cultural Blueprinting Toolkit. In this video, I'm going to give you an overview of some of the tools that are included, some of the content that's included in this toolkit, and some of the processes that we suggest you use in your organization to implement the suggestions, the tools, the strategies in this toolkit. But let me emphasize, this is a toolkit. It is not a cookie cutter. It's not a little magic pill that's going to make everything easy for you. It is a set of tools and strategies and great ideas that if you use them will help you do a much better job of building a great culture. And that is so important. You've probably heard the saying, culture eats strategy for lunch. And the first person who ever said that, who coined the phrase, was Peter Drucker, the great management consultant. And the reason you hear it so often is because there's so much truth to it. And I know something about your organization, whether you have 5 people or 5,000 people or anywhere in between or beyond. I'm sure you have a strategic plan because that's sort of management 101. We all have to have a strategic plan. I'm also pretty sure that like almost every other organization in the country, in the world, you don't have a culture plan. You have not put nearly as much thought into the culture you want to have as you have the strategies that you have to use to achieve your bottom line results. But if culture eats strategy for lunch, if you really believe that, shouldn't you have a plan for your culture that is just as well thought out as the plans you have for your strategies? At Values Coach, we talk about what we call the invisible architecture of your organization, the blueprint behind the blueprint. And when it comes to the invisible architecture, that more than anything else defines the impact that you have on your customers or in healthcare on your patients. Defines more than anything else the experience of being an employee or of being recruited to be an employee in your organization. And one of the things that we'll do in this toolkit is help you think about this invisible architecture. We'll actually use a construction metaphor in which the foundation of our invisible architecture is your core values. And we'll talk a lot about values and how do you create a source of competitive advantage from your values. The superstructure is corporate culture, the personality, the character of your organization. And we'll talk about how do you create a plan that establishes the expectations you have to build that sort of a culture. And then in a building, after you put down the foundation and put up the superstructure, you come in and you finish it off with wallpaper and carpeting. And in our invisible architecture metaphor, that's the attitude in your workplace. And how do you create those attitudinal and behavioral expectations, the zero tolerance behaviors that you simply will not put up with to reinforce that invisible architecture? And you know, when you're building a building, if you have a great architect and a great builder, it's seamless. You can't tell where the foundation ends and the walls begin. It's all seamless. Same thing with your invisible architecture. The culture flows naturally out of your values and helps establish those behavioral expectations. And if you do it right, you end up with something that creates a significant source, a sustainable source of competitive advantage at 2 levels. Internally, you create a level of pride, a level of loyalty, a level of commitment that helps you be much more competitive when it comes to recruiting and retaining great people. And externally, you've probably heard that your culture, more than anything, is the brand. It's not what you say your brand is, but the culture defines the brand of your organization. And if you have a great culture, it is the best tool you can have for recruiting loyal customers or in healthcare, loyal patients. So in this toolkit, here's what's included. This video, in which I give you a quick overview and talk about some of what's in it, preview the modules, 6 webinars, 6 one-hour webinars on each of the topics that I'll summarize in a minute. And each webinar, I'll give you a set of PowerPoint slides, typically between 200 and 300 and some slides, so that you can download. You can use it to print out note-taking handouts. You can use it for presentations in your own organization. You can tailor it, delete some slides, add your own pictures, add your own text. But you have a great resource for helping you share the concepts, share the ideas, share the strategies and the tools that are in this toolkit with the people in your organization. Companion to the webinars, there's a workbook. And there's a section for each module, and the workbook has strategies and great ideas, real-world examples of best practices and worst practices, and it has the tools that can help you build the blueprint for that invisible architecture, and then to actually implement it. And then we have a website, and on the website, many of the tools that are in the workbook you can download. You can download the tools, the posters, the worksheets, some of the forms that we have in the workbook or in the webinar slides, so that you can actually put them to use in your own organization. And that's password protected. It's only for people who are participating in the cultural blueprinting process with Values Coach. There's also an optional additional service for the people who want to do a little bit more, and that's the Values Advisor Consulting Service. And this is a monthly program. It's a monthly fee that you pay. And that includes once a month you get either a newsletter, a special report, or a webinar in which I take some concept that's in the toolkit and drill much deeper. So we look at lots more real-world examples of people who are doing whatever it is we're covering. We talk about additional strategies. And I share ideas that we get from people who are participating or answer some of the questions that you have that I think are going to be universal. So we share ideas, we share best practices. It also includes email advice. So if you're working on the toolkit and you say, we need some advice or we need some guidance on this, you send me an email and I respond, typically within 24 hours. And there's an optional addition that we can do conference calls with your leadership team or individual coaching to help you make more effective use of this investment you're making in your organization. Let me share with you some of the key success factors, the most important things we've learned about what it takes to make this work in your organization. And there are 5 things. Number 1, there has to be top leadership support. And I'm assuming the fact that you're participating in this, that the CEO, the director, whoever is the head of the organization is behind it. But that is so important that they be visible, that they participate in the activities, and that they get out of the way on occasion when their team really starts to get rolling. One thing I'll say to the top leadership team, there is research evidence, and it's reinforced by our experience, that the higher you get on the organization chart, the rosier your glasses are. So if you ask somebody in housekeeping or in the parking lot, parking cars, what's the culture like here? You're probably going to get a very different answer than if you go into the CEO. And typically the CEO is wearing much rosier glasses. And one of the challenges that we give you in this toolkit is to take off those rose-colored glasses and objectively assess what your current culture is. Objectively assess what are the attitudes and the behaviors that I as a customer or I as a patient or I as a new employee would actually experience in your organization, and not the assumptions that you're making about what I would experience. Second key success factor, and in many cases this is the most important, and that is middle management, engagement, and enthusiasm. Nothing will kill any initiative more quickly than having middle managers who are not engaged, who are not participating in it. And nothing will give any initiative, any program, anything you do, more wind in the sails than having middle managers who think it's the best thing that's ever happened and who attack it with enthusiasm and passion and want to make it work. And I'd share 2 specific expectations that you have to have for your middle management team. One, we'll talk about a book by Jim Clifton. He's the head of Gallup, the polling organization, and he wrote a new book called The Coming Jobs War. And we're headed into the worst staffing shortage in the history, or of at least of a very long time, as all of the baby boomers retire, and there are not enough highly skilled, trained people coming in the next generational cohort. And he said it is going to be a war for talent, and the talent's going to win. And he said something in that book that's very important. He said a disengaged employee is a defect every bit as much as programming the wrong code into a computer or giving a patient the wrong medication. And he says especially a disengaged manager is a defect. And if you have managers who are not buying into this, who don't want to be a part of the culture, that is a defect in your organization, and you got to get them on board somehow. And the second thing I'd say, and it's related to that, so many organizations have what I think of as a culture of optionality. And they allow people to opt out. You don't want to be a positive part of the community? Fine. Just come in and do your job, and that's fine. and especially with managers. And if you're working on a cultural blueprint, your expectation should be that if you're part of our team, you will be part of our culture. You can't sit on the sidelines and opt out, or more likely sit on the sidelines and throw rocks at something that you don't want to be a part of. The third key success factor is having a growing core of the people we call spark plugs throughout the organization. And this may begin, if you take our suggestion and have a cultural blueprinting team, you get some of those spark plug people on that group. In another area, our values collaborative, the people that we see become certified values trainers. Those are the spark plugs who go out and they share not only content, but they share their passion, their enthusiasm, their commitment with other people. One of the most important challenges, and one of the questions we get asked all the time, frankly, is how do we keep it going? How do we make sure this isn't just, another program of the month? That's the answer. You have spark plug people who have made a personal investment in whatever it is you're trying to do throughout the organization. And then it matters a whole lot less if someone in leadership changes, something changes in the outside environment. These people are committed. It's become part of their life, so it becomes an integral part of your organizational culture. And that gets me to the fourth thing that we've learned, the key success factor. The great Zig Ziglar, the motivational speaker who we recently lost, used to say, everybody listens to the same radio station, WIIFM, what's in it for me? And if you can remember, the reason so many customer service programs, the reason so many culture change programs, the reason so many programs of the month end at the end of the month is because leadership is saying, we're going to do this for the shareholders, we're going to do this for the patients, we're going to do this for my bonus. And they don't say, we're going to do this to help you be a better parent. We're going to do this because we know you're struggling with the same things at home, do more with less, that we're struggling with at work in the organization. So we're going to help you be a better person, be a better professional. Oh, and by the way, if enough people in our organization make some of those changes, it will help us have a stronger culture. And if you can keep in mind the reason you're doing this is to help your people be better people, to help them achieve their personal and their professional goals, with the byproduct being better patient satisfaction, customer satisfaction, productivity, profitability, whatever it is. Those things are byproducts of investing in people. And if that is your good faith, genuine approach to this, you're going to be a lot more successful. The great military historian B.H. Liddell Hart, he studied every major battle in the history of the world, and he said almost every one was won by some form of the indirect approach. Instead of the pickets charge, charge straight ahead at the enemy, he said the great commanders figure out some indirect way. And that's applicable here. Instead of saying, we got to do this for the customers, make that the byproduct. Do the indirect approach and invest in people, and you will find the benefit come back to the organization. That's why we talk about values training as being the gift to your people that is also an investment in your organization. And of course, the fifth key success factor is simply to do the work. And each webinar ends with homework assignments. And instead of rolling your eyes, homework, I'm too old for homework, do the exercises, do the homework, come back the next time and talk about it as a group. You will be much more successful, much more effective, much more likely to have something that is sustained over a period of time than if you just watch the webinar and then assume everything's going to take care of itself. So let's do a quick preview of what the 6 modules are. And here's the process we recommend to you. First of all, have the senior leadership team, however you define that, watch at least the first 2 modules so that you know what it's about and where you're going, so that if people ask you questions about it, you're able to answer those questions. Ideally, you'll go through all 6 as a senior team. But then have your middle management group and or your cultural blueprinting team go through all 6 modules. And we recommend that be 2-hour sessions, so 6 2-hour sessions, beginning with 30 minutes about talking about the previous module, or this video if it's the first module, talking about your goals, what you've done, reviewing the homework that's been done. We often ask people to come in and make short reports about things they've done. Then watch the next webinar, which is 1 hour. Every one of them is about 1 hour, exactly 1 hour. And then the next 30 minutes talk about what we're going to do. and what the assignments we're going to do, the other things we're going to do on our own. So here's an overview of the 6 modules. Module number 1, the foundation, we talk about employee engagement and building a culture of ownership, which is really the only long-term sustainable source of competitive advantage you can have, is having that sort of culture where people are thinking like partners, they're thinking like owners, and not like hired hands, not like people who are renting a spot on the organization chart, not like people for whom the job description is a ceiling, a limit on what they can do, but people who see the job description as the basics. That's the foundation to which they add their own special touch. We'll talk about the downside of employee disengagement, which is rampant in our organization, in our nation. And I mentioned Jim Clifton earlier, and he says something that I think is right on target. If we could just double the number of people who are engaged in their work from 25% to 50%, that still means more than half of the people aren't coming to work every day with their A game. He said we would eliminate every major problem in this country. And if that's true, and it is, think of what doubling the number of people who think like partners in your organization would do to productivity, to customer or patient satisfaction, to your bottom line. This is probably the biggest opportunity you have to make significant changes in your organization. We'll talk about some diagnostics that you can use, the attitude bell curve, and where do you fall on that distribution of, we call them spark plugs, zombies, and vampires. The disengaged, the engaged, and the highly engaged people. We'll give you several tools for assessing your culture, one of which is going to make you uncomfortable because you're asking all of your employees to evaluate what your culture is like presently. And finally, we're going to give you a formula to create what we call a memory of the future. The 6 A's for how do you create a mental picture of your ideal culture that is so powerful, so compelling, that it gives you a virtual roadmap for how to get there. The second module is an overview of the invisible architecture of your organization. So we go through that construction metaphor of the foundation of core values, the superstructure of corporate culture, the interior finishing of emotional attitude. And I'll describe in the webinar for that module, I'll describe 8 essential characteristics that you must have in a culture of ownership. And we'll talk about, I mentioned the WIIFM, what's in it for me factor. We'll talk about in both the webinar and in the workbook how important it is for you to focus on people's individual, personal values, that investment in the person. Kouzes and Posner, who wrote the book The Leadership Challenge, say their research shows that the more clear an individual is about his or her personal values, the more committed they will be to the values, the vision, the mission of their organization. And most important, when you start building a building, the first step is you do a schematic design process. This is the big picture, the broad brush. This is where you can say, no, we don't want the basement there. We want to move it over there. And you can do it and it doesn't cost you anything. It gives you that broad picture and it gives people incredible freedom to move rooms around. Once you get the walls up, it gets a whole lot more expensive. And that's how we start the invisible architecture process, is with that sort of broad brush schematic design. And we'll give you some tools for doing that. But finally, anytime you try to do something to change your culture, anytime you try to do something to create a more positive, more resilient workplace, you're going to have resistance. And we'll summarize 9 different forms of resistance. I think I missed the creatures of resistance, and each one has an animal assigned to it. So we'll describe the things that you're probably going to anticipate and some strategies that you can use to counter that resistance and get those people, if not on board, to at least neutralize the negativity that they're going to potentially bring to your process. The third module, we go deeper into that foundation of core values. And we talk about what does the ideal statement of values include. And it should describe who you are, what you stand for, what you won't stand for. But it also should create a sense of pride in the organization. It should also be operationally relevant. It should also be societally relevant. And we'll look at lots of real-world examples of how people have used values to create that expectation of who we are, what we do, what we expect of the people who work here, but also how do we use our values as a way of defining who we are to the world, creating that image, that source of competitive advantage. And again, I emphasize, in the real world, there is no cookie cutter. There are great organizations that have 3 values. There's one organization that you'll hear about in the toolkit that has 7 values, 8 guiding principles, and 40 plus statements defining what they mean. And there's everything in between. And the question is not what's the cookie cutter. The question is what works best for you? What is most authentic for you and for your organization? I'll talk about some of the most frequent questions that we get about values and having a statement of values. But one that we hear very often is, well, are you really serious that people should know all of our values by heart? That if you wake someone up in the middle of the night and say, tell me what our values are, they'd be able to tell you all 10 of them or however many it is. And I'm absolutely serious. And we'll talk about why that is, why it's so important. If you want to make that proverbial jump from good to great, you must expect all of your people know what your values are. And not only that, know why were those values chosen, because creating a statement of values forces you to make choices and set priorities, doesn't it? And that they know what it means in terms of the expectations the organization has for them and the expectations they can have for the organization where they work. And again, we'll give lots of real-world examples for that. And we'll also talk about the essential interface between personal values and corporate values, organizational values. And here's what I think of it as. Your organization's values they are the foundation of the strategies that you use, because most organizational values really aren't values, they're outcomes. Things like excellence, quality, safety, financial performance, growth, profitability. Those things are outcomes. And you connect those outcomes with personal values that inspire the behaviors that create the outcomes. One of the tools we share is the values, behaviors, outcomes continuum, and show you how to use that. We also talk about creating behavioral expectations. And this is so vitally important. If you have a set of values, but I as a new employee, I as a customer, I as a patient observe your people acting in violation of those values, you've just lost a whole lot of credibility and potentially lost a future customer or a new employee who goes somewhere else. And one of the things that we will be very emphatic about is establishing your zero tolerance behaviors. And there's some that are obvious, there's some that are going to be industry or organization specific, but getting clear about what are the things that you simply will not tolerate will help you rise above the pack of mediocre organizations where anything goes, or they're quick to look the other way at people who may make a lot of money for the company, but they are bullies, they are arrogant, they somehow drag everybody else around them down. And you need to establish your zero tolerance behaviors for that. And finally, we wrap up this particular module with an overview of our course on personal values, the 12 core action values, and how you can apply some of that to the work of creating the foundation for your organization of organizational values. Module number 4, we build on that foundation of values with the superstructure of corporate culture. Culture is, I think of culture as the personality, the character of your organization. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus said, character is destiny for the organization, the company, the hospital, whatever it is. Culture is destiny. Your culture defines who you are. Enron, for example, had brilliant strategies. They had very ambitious, obviously, leadership. What brought that company down more than anything else is they had a seriously flawed culture. And we'll review organizations that are in the same business, but very, very different customer and employee experience. Southwest Airlines versus United Airlines. They're flying the same planes. They're recruiting the same kind of people to be pilots and flight attendants and mechanics. The difference is not the business they're in. It's not even their business model as much as it is their culture. We'll talk about 8 essential characteristics that you must have to build a culture of ownership, and some of the ways that you can reinforce and enhance those characteristics in your organization. And we'll illustrate that with real-world best practices for how do people create that sort of culture. And again, most important, we'll give you a cultural mapping tool that will actually help you create a specific and precise roadmap for what are the things we have to do to build upon the characteristics of a culture of ownership to achieve our ideal outcomes. Now we move on to module number 5. And again, back to our construction metaphor. When you build a building, after you've put up the walls, you come in and you finish it off with wallpaper and carpeting, the interior finishings, furniture. That's the emotional attitude in the workplace. And that is what I, as a new employee, or I, as a customer or a patient in your organization, that's what creates my real impression, is how do you make me feel? And that's defined by the attitude in the workplace. You've probably heard the saying, attitude is everything. And one of the things that I'll point out in the webinar is that's not quite true. A great attitude will not make you a brain surgeon, but a lousy attitude will make you a bad brain surgeon. And working on collectively on the attitude in the workplace helps you raise what we think of as the invisible ceiling on the performance potential of your organization. If you have a lot of people with a bad attitude, a lot of people struggling internally with a poor self-image, poor self-esteem, listening to negative self-talk, inability to confront fear, unwillingness to change, those things collectively create the attitude of your organization, and they are either an anchor holding you back or they're the wind in your sails. And in this webinar, we'll share a lot of very practical tools for how do you, first of all, eradicate toxic emotional negativity. How do you eradicate the chronic complaining, finger pointing, playing the victim, blame game, gossiping, the things that are so toxic to an organization. I think of those things as cigarette smoke for the soul, because they are just as emotionally toxic as cigarette smoke is physically toxic. And there's actually a fair amount of research in the field of emotional intelligence, summarized most effectively by Daniel Goleman, that verifies at a physiological level those things are harmful. I'll share with you some shocking data on the prevalence of toxic emotional negativity in organizations. And if you take off your rose-colored glasses, you'll see that you have a problem in your organization, because every organization is somewhere on that continuum of the attitude bell curve, and your job is to move to the right so that you encourage, honor, and reward the spark plugs. You wake up the zombies and you somehow marginalize the vampires, and if they're not willing to change and become an enthusiastic, cheerful, optimistic part of the team, they go to work for your competition and bring things down there. Some of the tools we'll share, the passion performance matrix, and this is very valuable at a personal level. We've seen people look at that matrix and go, oh my God, I'm in the wrong quadrant. I need to work on this. And at an organizational level, it's a great assessment tool. But most important, in this module, we start getting into some of the life-changing tools that can help people make their lives better. And when enough people do that, it makes your organization better. And I'll just mention two of them right now. One is the Self-Empowerment Pledge. 7 simple promises that will change your life. And note very carefully, I did not say can, might, could, or should. We have seen people, by taking these 7 promises on responsibility, accountability, determination, resilience, perspective, and faith, those promises, people have made huge changes in their life just by holding themselves accountable, being responsible, being committed to making a contribution to the world. Now, when enough people start making those promises, they have a positive impact on the organization. And one of the things we're seeing, and it actually sort of surprises me, we're seeing more and more organizations where people gather in groups every day and make those promises to themselves and to each other. There's a hospital in Nebraska, Tri-Valley Health System. Roger Steinkruger, the CEO, told me that's been one of the most powerful things affecting their culture. You can actually go online, type in Tri-Valley Health System Pledge, and you'll see a 2-minute YouTube video, and you'll see about 50 people as a group in unison making Wednesday's promise on determination to each other. And if you really look carefully, more than half of the people in that group are not reading it. They are doing it by heart. The other thing we'll share is the pickle challenge. And we call it the pickle challenge because people who are always whining and complaining look like they have a dill pickle stuck in their mouth. And this thing has taken on a life of its own. Not a week goes by, hardly a day goes by some weeks that I don't hear from somebody about something they're doing with this pickle. And I think because it's so much fun, it's lighthearted, but it's also so effectively powerful at getting people to change their attitudes. It's a very simple promise. I will turn every complaint, my head is killing me, into a blessing, thank God for modern pharmacology, or a constructive suggestion. For a symptom of dehydration is a headache, I should drink some water. And there's nothing that somebody can complain about that cannot be turned into a blessing and or a constructive suggestion. We are seeing singing pickles, dancing pickles, pickle piñatas, people bringing in pickle jars and fining each other for toxic emotional negativity, pickle posters, pickle songs. It is amazing the things that we're seeing. And in some cases, we hear the word miracle to describe the changes that people have made in their life simply by refusing to be a victim and by finding the blessings in whatever hardships they have. And then in module number 6, our wrap-up, we talk about transforming leadership. James McGregor Burns wrote the book that won the Pulitzer Prize in 1976 called Leadership. And he talked about 2 kinds of leadership. Transactional leadership, that's the left brain stuff, running the business, making the transactions work. Someone gives you money, you give them a product or a service. You give someone a paycheck, they give you work. That is essential. You got to run the business. But the other kind of leadership he talked about is transforming leadership. And that is a relationship between leader and follower in which he said both are changed, both are transformed. So we'll talk about the 4 dimensions of values-based leadership. They are character, having that personal character strength that we expect from our leaders. Expectations, that's what leaders do. They create high expectations for themselves and for us and then help us live up to those expectations. The third is fellowship. The best leaders, they don't just create teams and committees, they create a fellowship, a spirit of camaraderie, of collegiality in their organizations. And the fourth, and maybe most important, is quest, because that's what great leaders do. Whether it's Ray Kroc telling people to fall in love with a hamburger bun at McDonald's, or Millard Fuller trying to change the world by eradicating poverty housing everywhere with Habitat for Humanity, great leaders help us find a sense of meaning in whatever the work is. You know, Ecclesiastes said, whatever your hand finds to do, do with all your might. Leaders inspire us to do that. The other thing we'll do in this webinar and workbook is talk about what are the leadership archetypes. And in my opinion, the best book that has ever been written on different styles of leadership is a novel. It's J.R.R. Tolkien's trilogy, The Lord of the Rings. And every major leadership archetype is reflected in that book. And so we'll use that as kind of a fun way of challenging you to look at your own leadership and the leadership of the people who work around you. And we'll wrap this up because I really believe if you want to change the culture of your organization, it can't be a program, it can't be an initiative, it's got to be a movement. And we'll look at one of the most successful movements of the last 50 years or so, the movement to eradicate toxic cigarette smoke in the workplace. You know, 20 years ago, people smoked everywhere. And today, there are very few, if any, public places where people can pollute you with their cigarette smoke. And when you consider that nicotine's an addictive drug and that smoking was ubiquitous, and back then they talked about smokers' rights and things like that. Well, you don't hear that term anymore. This movement has had a huge impact on our world. Something that was considered impossible in 1986 is now our reality. What are the lessons we can learn from that movement about creating positive cultural change in your organization? And finally, we'll talk about what's your legacy as a leader in your organization. And I mean, you don't have to be a manager to have a leader's legacy. And one of the most important legacies you can leave is the values, the culture, the attitude that you leave behind in your workplace. So it's going to be quite an adventure. We're going to have a lot of fun. You're going to have a lot of fun. It's going to be a lot of work, but anything worth doing is a lot of work. And someday you're going to look back and say, we are a much better organization. We're more resilient. We're more entrepreneurial. We're more productive. We're more positive. We're recruiting and retaining better people. It's a better place to work. We have more fun at work. And it's a more rewarding place for me to work. And I'm very proud of what I've done. And that's my goal for you, is that you will eventually, soon, look back and say, boy, I am really proud of what we did. Look at the invisible architecture of this organization. We've accomplished a great deal. And I look forward to being a partner with you in this journey of creating the blueprint and implementing and building on the invisible architecture of your organization. Let's get to work.